We live in a world defined by cause and effect, by observable data, and by the rigorous testing of ideas. We rely on medicine that has been peer-reviewed, engineering that adheres to the laws of physics, and history that is backed by archaeological evidence. Yet, there is a massive carved-out exception in the minds of millions of people where these standards simply do not apply. We treat religious claims with a strange kind of kid gloves, often refusing to subject them to the same basic scrutiny we would apply to a used car salesman or a politician. When you actually stop and apply standard logic to the specific doctrines of the Catholic Church, the friction between reality and dogma becomes impossible to ignore. We aren't talking about vague spirituality here, or a general sense of comfort. We are talking about specific, codified beliefs that, when dragged into the light of modern understanding, start to unravel. The first of these is the doctrine of transubstantiation. This isn't just a symbolic meal. If you ask a layperson, they might tell you the bread and wine represent the body and blood of Jesus, like a metaphor or a remembrance. But that is not what the institution actually teaches. The official dogma is that the substance of the bread and the wine literally changes into the substance of a human body and blood, while the accidents, the taste, the smell, the texture, and the chemical composition remain exactly the same. This is a claim that relies entirely on a category of ancient philosophy that human knowledge has long since surpassed. It relies on Aristotelian metaphysics, which suggested that objects have an invisible substance distinct from their physical properties. We know now that this distinction doesn't exist. An object is defined by its atomic structure. Gold is gold because of its protons and electrons. Bread is bread because of its carbohydrate structure. There is no magical breadness floating underneath the atoms that can be swapped out for fleshness, while the atoms stay put. When you analyze this without the lens of reverence, it sounds less like a divine mystery and more like a semantic loophole created to defend a claim that creates no evidence. If you claim a piece of cracker has turned into human heart tissue, we should be able to measure that. We can test DNA. We can analyze proteins. If every single test says wheat and water, and you still insist it is flesh, you have effectively detached your definition of truth from reality. You are asking people to suspend their trust in their own senses, sight, taste, touch, in favor of a decree. It trains the mind to accept that authority overrides observable fact. That is a dangerous precedent to set for how a person processes information in every other aspect of their life. It points to a psychological need for tangibility. It isn't enough for a deity to be a spiritual concept. The human brain craves a totem, something to touch and consume. It is essentially a form of magical thinking that mirrors alchemy. The idea that a specific incantation spoken by a specific man in a specific outfit can manipulate the fabric of matter is something we would recognize as mythology in any other context. If a person walked into a courtroom and claimed that a glass of water was actually a glass of arsenic, but admitted it still tasted, looked, and chemically tested like water, they would be laughed out of the room. Yet this assertion remains the central pillar of the liturgy, defended not by proof, but by the demand that you simply stop asking how it works. Then we move to the concept of original sin. This is perhaps one of the most ethically backwards concepts ever devised. The core teaching is that human beings are born broken, carrying a stain of guilt from the moment of conception, not because of anything they have done, but because of the actions of two proto-humans thousands of years ago. From a scientific perspective, this collapses immediately. We know through genetics and the fossil record that there was never a single pair of first humans. The human population evolved from a group, not a dyad of Adam and Eve in a garden. If the literal progenitors didn't exist, the specific act of disobedience didn't happen. If the act didn't happen, the transmission of this stain is impossible. The Church has tried to pivot to a metaphorical reading of Genesis to align with evolution, but they refuse to let go of the literal consequences. You cannot have a metaphorical fall that requires a literal savior. But look at the morality of it. Even if we accepted the story as true, the ethics are repugnant. We do not imprison the children of murderers for the crimes of their parents. We recognize individual responsibility as the bedrock of justice. To assert that a newborn infant, capable of no action, no intent, and no malice, is inherently disordered or estranged from the source of all good is a deeply cynical view of humanity. It essentially creates a problem that only the organization can solve. It's a manufactured sickness sold alongside the only approved cure, which is baptism and church membership. This worldview frames human nature as something that needs to be suppressed and corrected, rather than nurtured and understood. It tells people that their natural instincts, their skepticism, and their desire for autonomy are symptoms of a spiritual disease. When you convince people they are sick from birth, they become dependent on your medicine. It is a brilliant retention strategy, but as a description of reality, it fails. We see altruism, cooperation, and empathy in other social primates. We see moral behavior evolve as a survival mechanism in groups. We don't need a metaphysical stain to explain why humans are sometimes selfish or violent. We are complex animals with competing drives. Labeling our imperfections as sin, inherited from a ghost story, cheapens the hard work of actually building a moral society through education and empathy. Furthermore, this belief in inherited guilt justifies a history of authoritarian control. If people are naturally broken, they cannot be trusted with their own freedom. They need a shepherd. They need strict boundaries. It rationalizes the hierarchy. If you believe you are born in debt to a cosmic landlord, you will spend your whole life paying installments without ever asking to see the lease. It shifts the focus from, how do we build a better world, to, how do I save my own skin from a penalty I didn't earn? It is startling when you realize that these aren't just quirks of the faith, they are the foundation. If you pull out the literal body in the bread, the ritual loses its power. If you pull out the inherited guilt, the need for salvation evaporates. These beliefs are maintained not because they make sense, but because the entire structure relies on them. Consider the structure of authority within the system. We arrive at the doctrine of Papal Infallibility. This is a thoroughly modern invention, formally defined only in the late 19th century, yet it retroactively claims that the Bishop of Rome is preserved from error when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals. This assertion is breathtaking in its arrogance. It places a single human being, elected by a political body of other men, above the correction of data, history, and evolving ethical standards. In every other field of human endeavor, admitting a mistake is the primary mechanism of progress. Science advances because we disprove old models. Medicine improves because we acknowledge when a treatment fails. But this dogma traps the institution in a state of arrested development. If a past pope declared something to be definitively true, a current pope cannot simply say, he was wrong. They must engage in elaborate mental gymnastics to reinterpret the old statement to mean something it clearly didn't, or argue that the previous statement wasn't technically ex cathedra. This results in a culture of gaslighting, where the faithful are told that the teaching has never changed, even when it manifestly has. Look at the history. We have records of popes condoning slavery, authorizing torture during the Inquisition, and condemning democratic principles as heresy. If the Holy Spirit protects this office from error in moral teaching, that protection has a failure rate that would be unacceptable in a toaster, let alone a divine guide. The doctrine forces intelligent people to defend the indefensible simply because a man in a white cassock said it centuries ago. It creates a fragility in the belief system. If you admit the Pope was dead wrong about a major moral issue in 1450, you open the door to questioning what he is wrong about today. To prevent that cascade, the institution demands an adherence to authority that supersedes conscience. It infantilizes the believer, suggesting that moral truth is not something to be reasoned out or discovered through empathy and consensus, but something to be received like a memo from a CEO. This top-down command structure bleeds into the way the supernatural is accessed, specifically through the cult of the saints. This practice reveals a deep insecurity about the nature of the deity they worship. The theology claims that God is omniscient, all-loving, and intimately concerned with every hair on a person's head. Yet, in practice, the average believer operates as if this God is a busy bureaucrat who needs to be lobbied by a middleman. The veneration of saints is functional polytheism, with a coat of monotheistic paint. You have a patron saint for lost items, a patron saint for safe travel, a patron saint for throat ailments. This is indistinguishable from ancient pagan pantheons where you had a god of the sea and a god of the harvest. It suggests that the supreme deity is too distant, too frightening, or too busy to handle the small stuff. You need a specialist. You need someone who was once human to put in a good word for you. The logistics of this belief are absurd when you strip away the sentimentality. To believe that a deceased human being, like St. Anthony or St. Jude, can hear the simultaneous mental prayers of millions of people around the globe, in different languages, process them, and then negotiate with the Creator to alter the laws of physics or probability on your behalf, is to attribute powers to them that are essentially godlike. It requires the dead to be omniscient and omnipresent. Furthermore, it encourages a transactional view of the universe. It turns spirituality into a vending machine. You put in the novena, you light the candle, you wear the scapular, and you get the result. When the result happens, it's a miracle. When it doesn't, it's a mystery or God's will. This is the classic trap of confirmation bias. The hits are recorded, the misses are ignored. We see this most clearly in the industry of relics. The obsession with the physical remains of the dead, bones, hair, vials of blood, or scraps of clothing, is macabre. It is magical thinking in its rawest form. The belief that a bone fragment in a reliquary transmits spiritual power is an idea that belongs in the Bronze Age. It creates a false economy of hope. People traveling to shrines like Lourdes or Fatima in search of physical healing are often desperate. They are suffering. To sell them the idea that the water from a specific spring or proximity to a specific corpse increases their chances of recovery is exploitative. We know how the placebo effect works. We know how spontaneous remission works. But the Church categorizes the unexplained as the miraculous, utilizing the God of the gaps fallacy. As medical knowledge expands, the space for these miracles shrinks. We used to think epilepsy was demonic possession. Now we have neurology. We used to think plague was a punishment. Now we have microbiology. Yet the mindset that looks for a supernatural shortcut remains, encouraged by a hierarchy that benefits from being the gatekeepers of these favors. This magical worldview diverts energy from actual solutions. If you believe that praying to St. Jude, the patron of lost causes, is a viable strategy for solving a crisis, you may be less inclined to take the difficult, practical steps necessary to change your situation. It externalizes agency. Instead of taking ownership of the chaos of life, the believer delegates it to a pantheon of invisible friends. It is comforting, certainly. It feels good to think someone is looking out for you. But comfort is not truth. A security blanket makes a child feel safe, but it stops no bullets and cures no fevers. There is also a profound unfairness built into this system of intercession. It implies that God is swayed by popularity contests. If a sick child has 10,000 people praying for them, are they more likely to survive than the sick child with no one praying for them? If yes, then God is capricious, playing favorites based on the lobbying power of the petitioner. If no, then the prayer is functionally useless. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim prayer changes outcomes and simultaneously claim God has a perfect, unchangeable plan. The doctrine tries to hold these contradictory positions, resulting in a confused theology that collapses under the weight of its own inconsistency. This brings us to the mechanism by which the institution manages the guilt it cultivates, the sacrament of confession. The idea that you must whisper your private failings to a specific man in a box to receive absolution is one of the most brilliant psychological control tools ever devised. It creates a closed loop of shame and relief that binds the believer to the institution. You are told you are sick with sin, and the priest holds the only antidote. From a secular standpoint, the power dynamic here is staggering. It normalizes the invasion of privacy. It trains people, from childhood, to disclose their most intimate thoughts, sexual habits, and moral lapses to an authority figure who holds power over their eternal fate. In any other context, we would call this data mining or grooming. It consolidates information and leverage in the hands of the hierarchy. But the deeper failure of confession is ethical. It fundamentally distorts the nature of forgiveness and restitution. In a rational moral framework, if you harm someone, you owe a debt to that person. If you steal from a neighbor, morality demands you return the property and apologize to the neighbor. In Catholicism, the offense is rerouted. The crime is primarily against God. You go to a priest, you admit the fault, you say some prayers as penance, and you are told you are clean. The victim is bypassed. The actual hard work of repairing relationships or making structural changes to one's behavior is replaced by a ritual. It allows people to feel good about themselves without necessarily doing good. It is a get-out-of-jail-free card for the conscience. This leads to a moral hazard. If you believe that a deathbed confession can wipe away a lifetime of cruelty, the incentive to live an ethical life is severely diminished. You can be a tyrant for 80 years, say the right words at the very end, and technically, according to the rules, you win. This gamification of morality suggests that the deity is more interested in bureaucratic submission than in the actual quality of a human character. It reduces ethics to a legal technicality. And what happens if you don't follow these rules? We arrive at the doctrine of hell. This is the ultimate stick used to enforce compliance. The belief in hell, a place of eternal conscious torment, is perhaps the most morally bankrupt idea in the history of human thought. The mathematics of it are grotesque. It posits an infinite punishment for a finite crime. Even the worst human being lives for only a handful of decades. To punish 70 years of behavior with trillions upon trillions of years of torture is not justice. It is sadism. If a human judge sentenced a shoplifter to be tortured for 1,000 years, we would lock that judge away as a psychopath. Yet Catholics are asked to worship a deity who does exactly this, and they are required to call him all-merciful. The cognitive dissonance required to hold God is love and God burns people forever in the same mind causes a fracture in logic. It forces the believer to redefine love and justice until they mean nothing at all. Furthermore, the criteria for this eternal punishment are often trivial. In traditional Catholic teaching, missing Mass on Sunday without a valid excuse is a mortal sin. If you die with that on your soul, unconfessed, the punishment is the same as for a mass murderer: eternal separation from God and torment. This equates a scheduling error with genocide. It portrays the creator of the universe as incredibly petty, obsessed with attendance records and ritual compliance, rather than the content of one's heart. This fear is not a side effect, it is the product. Fear arrests critical thinking. When you terrify children with images of fire and suffering, you bypass their intellect and wire their nervous system for obedience. It is trauma-based retention. Adults who leave the faith often report lingering hell anxiety years after they have intellectually rejected the dogmas. That is the mark of deep psychological conditioning. But the afterlife geography gets even more complicated and fiscally convenient with purgatory. This is the waiting room, where souls go to have the remaining stain of sin burned away before entering heaven. Unlike hell, there is practically zero scriptural basis for this place, even within their own holy text. It was a theological development that conveniently appeared as the church grew in political power. Purgatory introduced a time element to the afterlife that could be manipulated by the living. If your grandmother is suffering in purgatory, you want to help her. How? By paying the church. This gave rise to the sale of indulgences, certificates that reduced time in purgatory, which funded the construction of massive cathedrals like St. Peter's in Rome. While the church no longer sells paper certificates for cash, the concept remains alive. Masses are still offered for the dead, often with a stipend attached. The invention of purgatory reveals the transactional nature of the belief system. It creates a problem, temporary torture, and sells the solution, prayer, masses, and devotion. It keeps the dead on the payroll, so to speak. It ensures that even after a member dies, their family remains legally bound to the church, paying dues in the form of rituals to ensure the safety of the deceased. It exploits grief. When you are mourning, you are vulnerable. Telling a grieving person that their loved one is currently suffering but can be helped by a donation or a ritual is manipulative in the extreme. It also highlights the bureaucratic obsession of the theology. They have mapped out the afterlife with the precision of a city planner, distinguishing between limbo, now largely discarded, purgatory, hell, and heaven, with specific rules for transfer between zones. It claims knowledge where there is absolutely no data. No one has come back. No explorer has mapped these terrains. It is pure speculation codified as fact, used to manage the behavior of the living by holding the souls of the dead hostage. This obsession with controlling the intangible soul inevitably bleeds into a frantic need to control the physical body. This brings us to the mandate of clerical celibacy and the exclusion of women from the priesthood. Here, the institution fights a war against biology itself. The demand that tens of thousands of men suppress one of the most fundamental biological drives, the drive for companionship and sexual intimacy, is not a badge of spiritual honor. It is a recipe for psychological disaster. We are evolved primates. Our neurobiology is wired for connection. When you take young men, isolate them in a homosocial environment, tell them their natural urges are a source of danger, and forbid them from ever experiencing an adult romantic partnership, you are not creating superhumans. You are creating a state of arrested development. You sever them from the very experiences, marriage, parenting, financial struggle, compromising with a partner, that would make them capable of advising a congregation. It creates a caste of leaders who are structurally incapable of understanding the daily lives of the people they are supposed to lead. The historical context makes this even more cynical. Celibacy was not a mandate from the beginning. Peter, the first pope according to their own tradition, was married. The rule was solidified in the Middle Ages, not for spiritual purity, but for economic consolidation. The church didn't want priests leaving church property and wealth to their children. It was a measure to protect the assets of the corporation. Yet today, it is sold as a mystical sacrifice. This suppression creates a pressure cooker. It is impossible to discuss this without acknowledging the catastrophic levels of abuse that have occurred within the system. While celibacy does not cause pedophilia, the culture of secrecy, the old boys club mentality, and the absolute power of the priest over the laity created the perfect petri dish for predation. When you tell a man he is ontologically superior to his flock and answerable only to God, and then you frustrate his natural humanity, you create a dangerous, unchecked power dynamic. Coupled with this is the absolute refusal to ordain women. In the 21st century, the Catholic Church remains one of the only major global institutions that explicitly bars women from all top-level decision-making positions solely based on their chromosomes. They justify this by saying Jesus chose male apostles. This is a weak historical argument. Jesus also chose Jewish apostles. He chose Aramaic speakers. He chose men who wore sandals. The church doesn't mandate that priests must be Jewish Aramaic speakers. They cherry-pick which historical details are binding and which are cultural. By excluding women, the institution voluntarily lobotomizes itself. It disregards the insights, talents, and leadership capabilities of 50% of the human population. It ensures that all theology, all policy, and all moral enforcement is filtered exclusively through the male perspective. This is not tradition, it is enshrined sexism. It reinforces the Bronze Age idea that the male is the default human and the female is auxiliary. A god who is threatened by a woman at the altar is a god made in the image of insecure men. This desire to police gender roles transitions directly into the Church's disastrous teachings on contraception. This is perhaps the belief with the highest real-world body count. The teaching that artificial birth control is intrinsically evil is based on a philosophical fallacy known as natural law. The argument is that the purpose of sex is procreation, and therefore any act that blocks that purpose is a violation of nature. This reasoning is incoherent. We violate the natural purpose of biological functions all the time. The natural purpose of eyes is to see, yet we wear glasses when they fail. The natural purpose of the immune system is to fight off infection, yet we use antibiotics and vaccines to help it. We do not call wearing sunglasses intrinsically evil because it blocks the eye from receiving all the light. Yet, when it comes to reproductive organs, suddenly the biological function is treated as a divine command that cannot be tampered with. The consequences of this dogma are horrifying. In the developing world, the ban on condoms has contributed directly to the spread of HIV/AIDS. When the Church tells people in sub-Saharan Africa that using a condom is a sin, they are prioritizing abstract dogma over human survival. They are effectively saying that it is better to risk death and orphan your children than to block the transmission of sperm. This is a moral obscenity. Furthermore, it traps families in cycles of poverty. We know that the single most effective way to lift a community out of poverty is to give women control over their reproduction. When women can choose when and how many children to have, they can pursue education, they can work, and they can invest more resources into the children they do have. By denying this right, the Church enforces a biological servitude. It treats women as incubators first and human beings second. The hypocrisy is revealed in the Church's acceptance of natural family planning, NFP. This method involves tracking a woman's cycle to avoid sex during fertile windows. The intent of NFP is exactly the same as the intent of a condom, to have sex without producing a baby. If the intent is the same, the moral weight should be the same. The Church is splitting hairs over the mechanics, arguing that how you avoid pregnancy matters more than why. It is a distinction without a difference, a legalistic loophole that allows them to pretend they aren't managing reproduction while doing exactly that. This fixity on sexual mechanics reveals a deep fear of human autonomy. If you control sex, you control the family unit. If you control the family unit, you control the next generation. It is not about life. If it were about life, they would support the contraception that reduces the abortion rate. But statistics consistently show that access to birth control drives abortion rates down. By opposing birth control, the Church actively contributes to the conditions that lead to more abortions. They are fighting the remedy to the problem they claim to hate. It exposes a rigidity that cannot survive contact with the modern world. The Church claims these rules are immutable truths. But when an immutable truth causes mass suffering, poverty, and disease, a rational observer must conclude that the truth is actually a lie. A moral system that produces immoral outcomes is broken. If your roadmap tells you to drive off a cliff, you don't blame the car or the gravity, you blame the map. This rigidity is also why the Church is hemorrhaging members in the developed world. People look at their own lives, their happy, healthy families built on the use of contraception, their equal partnerships, their LGBTQ friends and children, and they look at the Church calling these things disordered, and they realize the Church is simply wrong. Not mysteriously wrong or spiritually complex, but factually, demonstrably wrong about what leads to human flourishing.